Most people think silence is neutral. It's not. Silence is communication. Withdrawal is communication. Ignoring somebody is one of the loudest emotional signals a human being can send, because the brain is designed to react to uncertainty more intensely than certainty. And when an avoidant person ignores you, while you ignore them back, something extremely predictable starts happening psychologically. At first, both people feel powerful. That's the first stage. The avoidant tells themselves, "Good, I finally have space." The other person tells themselves, "Good, I'm done chasing." Both individuals believe distance will reduce emotional pressure. But the human nervous system doesn't work that way. The brain hates unresolved emotional tension, especially attachment tension. So instead of calming down, both people begin entering a silent psychological war where neither side speaks. But both sides become increasingly emotionally occupied by the other person. This is where people misunderstand avoidant behavior. Avoidants are not emotionless. They are emotion management specialists. Huge difference. Most avoidant individuals learned early in life that emotional dependence circa readed pain, unpredictability, criticism, or loss of control. So they adapted by creating distance whenever emotional intensity increased. Distance became safety. But here's the problem. The attachment system never actually turns off. It only suppresses expression. So when you disappear too, the avoidant brain suddenly loses predictability. And predictability is one of the most important psychological needs humans have. Now the avoidant begins monitoring, checking in directly, thinking constantly, replaying conversations, watching for signs, looking for emotional movement without actually initiating contact. Why? Because silence creates ambiguity, and ambiguity creates obsession. This is why people become mentally addicted to situations where nothing is happening externally. The brain starts trying to solve the emotional puzzle. Do they care? Are they moving on? Why haven't they contacted me? Are they trying to punish me? Did I lose control? Notice something important. The absence of communication often creates more emotional intensity than direct conflict. Because conflict at least provides certainty. Silence provides imagination. And imagination is psychology. Logically dangerous because humans almost always fill uncertainty with emotionally charged assumptions. Now here's where things become fascinating. When two people ignore each other long enough, they stop responding to reality and start responding to projections. They no longer interact with the actual person. They interact with the version created inside their own mind. One person imagines rejection. The other imagines betrayal. One imagines abandonment. The other imagines loss of freedom. This is why unresolved silence becomes emotionally exhausting. The nervous system stays activated without closure. And eventually, strange behaviors begin appearing. People start posting indirectly online, listening to emotional music repeatedly, checking timestamps, analyzing small signals, rereading old messages, creating fake emotional detachment while secretly remaining psychologically attached. Why? Because attachment bonds do not disappear simply because communication stops. In many cases, silence intensifies attachment because intermittent emotional access is neurologically powerful. This operates similarly to variable reward systems studied in behavioral psychology. The uncertainty itself increases focus. Now, let's talk specifically about the avoidant individual during this stage. Externally, avoidance may appear calm. Internally, many experience rising cognitive dissonance. Part of them wants reconnection. Another part fears emotional engulfment. This creates an internal push-pull conflict. So instead of communicating directly, they often wait for emotional safety signals. But if you are also ignoring them, both people remain trapped in emotional paralysis. Neither side wants vulnerability. Neither side wants rejection. Neither side wants to lose psychological leverage. And this is where ego enters the system. Ego loves silence because silence protects pride. But pride is terrible at building connection. Healthy relationships require tolerating vulnerability long enough for clarity to emerge. Without that, people begin competing over who cares less. And that competition destroys emotional trust. Now here's the educational part most people never hear. Ignoring an avoidant does not always create attraction. Sometimes it creates relief. Sometimes it creates panic. Sometimes it creates curiosity. And sometimes it creates permanent, emotional shutdown. The outcome depends on attachment history, emotional maturity, nervous system regulation, and the meaning the avoidant assigns to your absence. That's why manipulative no-contact strategies often fail when people use them emotionally instead of intelligently. If silence is used to punish, control, or provoke anxiety, the nervous system detects it as danger. And once someone associates you with emotional danger, attachment avoidance increases. But there's another possibility. Sometimes mutual silence creates forced self-awareness. Without constant emotional interaction, both people are finally left alone with themselves. And this is uncomfortable, because distractions disappear. Now people must confront their own patterns. Why do I fear closeness? Why do I withdraw? Why do I need control? Why does vulnerability feel unsafe? Why does silence affect me this deeply? These are the moments where emotional growth can begin. Not through manipulation, not through winning, but through awareness. Because emotionally intelligent people eventually realize something powerful. The goal is not to beat the avoidant. The goal is understanding the system both. People are trapped inside. Once you understand the system, the emotional chaos becomes predictable. And predictable systems can be changed. Healthy communication interrupts destructive patterns because clarity reduces threat perception inside the nervous system. Simple honesty is psychologically stabilizing. I felt disconnected. I needed space. But I also cared. I don't want games. I want clarity instead of silence. That kind of communication feels terrifying to emotionally defensive people. But it is the only thing that creates genuine emotional safety. Because silence may protect you temporarily, but over time, silence creates emotional distortion. And emotional distortion destroys connection faster than conflict ever will. Silence becomes a psychological weapon when two avoidant patterns collide because neither person is truly communicating what they feel, fear, or need. On the surface, it may appear calm, controlled, and emotionally detached, but underneath that silence, both nervous systems are reacting intensely. Human beings are biologically wired for emotional feedback and social connection, even when they consciously try to suppress it. When two avoidant individuals pull away from each other at the same time, the lack of communication creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is one of the most psychologically stressful experiences the brain can encounter. The mind begins searching for answers, patterns, and hidden meanings in the absence of clarity. Instead of peace, silence creates emotional tension that grows stronger over time. What makes this dynamic dangerous is that both people often believe they are protecting themselves. One person thinks distance will help them regain control, while the other convinces themselves they no longer care. In reality, both individuals are often monitoring each other emotionally from a distance. They may stop texting, calling, or expressing vulnerability, but mentally they remain deeply engaged. They replay conversations, analyze social media activity, wonder who will reach out first, and silently test whether the connection still exists. The silence becomes less about healing and more about emotional positioning. Neither side wants to appear weak, needy, or vulnerable, so both remain trapped in emotional paralysis. This creates a strange psychological conflict. The avoidant personality often fears emotional engulfment, rejection, or loss of independence. So withdrawal feels temporarily safe. But when the other person also disappears emotionally, the avoidant mind loses predictability. Suddenly, the person they expected to remain emotionally available is gone. This activates anxiety beneath the surface, even if the avoidant never openly admits it. The human brain struggles more with inconsistency and ambiguity than with direct pain. A difficult conversation provides certainty, but silence leaves room for imagination. And imagination often creates worse emotional scenarios than reality itself. Over time, silence transforms into a silent power struggle. Each person begins measuring who cares less, who can wait longer, and who will eventually break first. But emotional connection cannot survive inside a system built on avoidance and pride. Instead of resolving conflict, both people slowly become attached to assumptions and fantasies rather than truth. They stop interacting with the real person and start interacting with the version created inside their own mind. One imagines betrayal, while the other imagines abandonment. One fears losing freedom, while the other fears being forgotten. The most important thing to understand is that silence does not remove emotional attachment. In many cases, it intensifies it. The absence of communication keeps the nervous system activated because there is no closure, explanation, or resolution. This is why people can remain emotionally attached to someone they have not spoken to in months. The mind keeps searching for unfinished answers. Eventually, silence becomes emotionally exhausting because both people are carrying unresolved tension without expressing it. True emotional maturity begins when someone recognizes that silence is not always strength. Sometimes it is fear disguised as control. Healthy relationships require the ability to tolerate vulnerability, communicate honestly, and build trust, and face discomfort directly instead of hiding behind emotional distance. Ignoring each other creates emotional escalation, not emotional peace, because the human mind is not designed to remain comfortable inside unresolved emotional tension. Most people believe distance automatically reduces feelings, but psychologically, the opposite often happens. When two people suddenly stop communicating, the emotional connection does not instantly disappear. Instead, the silence removes clarity while leaving the emotional attachment active. The nervous system begins reacting to uncertainty, and uncertainty creates stress, overthinking, and emotional intensity. What looks like calm behavior on the outside is often internal chaos on the inside. At first, both people may feel temporary relief. There are no difficult conversations, no emotional confrontations, and no pressure to explain feelings. The silence feels like control. But emotional suppression is not emotional resolution. When emotions are left unresolved, the brain keeps searching for closure. This is why people continue thinking about someone long after communication ends. The mind naturally tries to complete unfinished emotional experiences. Without answers, people begin creating their own explanations. And these explanations are usually influenced by fear, insecurity, and emotional memory rather than reality. As the silence continues, emotional escalation begins quietly. One person wonders why the other has not reached out. The other starts questioning whether they were easily replaceable. Both individuals may act detached externally while becoming increasingly emotionally occupied internally. They start checking social media, analyzing indirect signals, replaying conversations, and imagining different scenarios. Every small action suddenly feels meaningful because silence forces the brain to interpret limited information. This creates psychological obsession, not emotional peace. The most dangerous part of mutual ignoring is that imagination replaces communication. Instead of asking direct questions, people begin assuming motives. One person interprets silence as rejection, while the other interprets it as punishment. One fears abandonment, while the other fears vulnerability. Over time, these assumptions become emotionally real, even when they may not reflect the truth. The brain responds to perceived emotional threats almost the same way it responds to actual threats. This means imagined stories can trigger real emotional pain, anxiety, anger, or sadness. Avoidant personalities especially struggle inside this dynamic because they often associate emotional closeness with discomfort or loss of control. Ignoring someone may initially feel safe because distance reduces emotional pressure. But when the other person also withdraws, the avoidant individual loses predictability. Suddenly, they no longer know where they stand emotionally. This uncertainty activates deeper attachment fears beneath the surface. Even if they do not openly express it, they may begin thinking about the relationship more intensely than before. At the same time, the other person may interpret the avoidant's silence as proof of emotional indifference. This misunderstanding increases emotional escalation on both sides. Instead of creating healing, the silence strengthens emotional insecurity. Both people become trapped in their own internal narratives while the real connection slowly deteriorates. Another reason ignoring each other creates escalation is because silence often turns into a power struggle. People stop focusing on understanding each other and start focusing on who will break first. Pride replaces honesty. Vulnerability feels dangerous, so both individuals protect their ego instead of protecting the relationship. Unfortunately, emotional distance rarely creates genuine safety. It creates emotional confusion. True peace comes from emotional clarity, not emotional absence. Healthy communication calms the nervous system because it reduces uncertainty. Even difficult conversations are usually healthier than prolonged silence because honesty gives the brain stability. Ignoring each other may temporarily avoid discomfort, but over time it increases emotional tension, deepens misunderstanding, and intensifies the psychological attachment both people are trying so hard to escape. The human brain interprets withdrawal as threat and uncertainty because human survival has always depended on connection, predictability, and emotional signals from other people. Long before modern relationships existed, the nervous system evolved to detect signs of separation or disconnection as potential danger. In ancient environments, being isolated from a group could mean vulnerability, loss of protection, or even death. Even today, the brain still reacts strongly to emotional withdrawal because it perceives sudden distance as something important that must be understood immediately. This is why silence, emotional coldness, or disappearing behavior can create intense psychological reactions even when no physical danger exists. When someone suddenly becomes distant, stops communicating, or emotionally pulls away, the brain immediately begins searching for explanations. It wants certainty. It wants clarity. The mind starts asking questions like, what changed? Did I do something wrong? Are they leaving? Do they still care? These questions appear automatically because uncertainty activates the brain's threat detection systems. The human nervous system prefers painful certainty over confusing ambiguity because certainty allows prediction, and prediction creates a sense of control. Without clear answers, the brain fills the silence with assumptions, fears, and imagined scenarios. This is why emotional withdrawal often creates obsession instead of detachment. Many people assume distance helps others forget, but psychologically, uncertainty increases mental focus. The brain becomes highly alert when emotional patterns suddenly change. If someone who was once warm becomes cold, or someone who was emotionally available suddenly disappears, the nervous system notices the disruption immediately. Human beings are pattern recognition machines. When expected emotional behavior changes unexpectedly, the brain treats it like unfinished business that needs resolution. Avoidant individuals often misunderstand this reason. Action. They may believe withdrawing protects them from emotional intensity, conflict, or vulnerability, and temporarily, it can create relief. But while withdrawal reduces external interaction, it often increases internal psychological activity for both people involved. The person being ignored becomes anxious about the loss of connection, while the avoidant person may secretly monitor the situation from a distance, wondering if the relationship still exists emotionally. Neither person feels fully secure because silence provides no emotional stability. The uncertainty becomes even more powerful because the brain naturally focuses on incomplete emotional experiences. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as the tendency to mentally revisit unresolved situations more intensely than resolved ones. A direct conversation may hurt temporarily, but it provides information. Withdrawal provides almost nothing, which forces the brain to keep searching for hidden meaning. This is why people replay old conversations, analyze text messages, watch social media activity, or think constantly about someone who has emotionally disappeared. The mind is trying to regain certainty. Another important factor is that emotional withdrawal activates fear differently for different attachment styles. Someone with anxious tendencies may interpret silence as abandonment or rejection. Someone avoidant may interpret emotional closeness as pressure or danger. Yet both nervous systems react strongly to uncertainty because uncertainty removes emotional predictability. Even emotionally independent people can become psychologically unsettled when someone important suddenly changes behavior without explanation. The brain also struggles because humans are deeply social creatures. Emotional connection regulates stress. Healthy communication helps calm the nervous system by creating reassurance, understanding, and emotional orientation. When communication disappears, the nervous system often stays activated because there is no resolution. This prolonged activation can create overthinking, emotional exhaustion, irritability, and anxiety. What makes withdrawal especially painful is that silence often feels personal, even when it is not intended that way. The brain naturally interprets emotional distance as meaningful. It searches for hidden causes and often blames the self first. Over time, this creates emotional escalation because the absence of clarity allows fear and imagination to take control. Ultimately, the human brain does not experience withdrawal as neutral. It experiences it as uncertainty, and uncertainty triggers the nervous system to prepare for emotional threat. That is why honest communication, even uncomfortable communication, is psychologically healthier than prolonged emotional disappearance. Avoidants often confuse emotional distance with emotional control because withdrawing from emotions can create the temporary illusion of stability. When an avoidant person steps back from emotional intensity, stops communicating, or suppresses vulnerable feelings, they may feel calmer on the surface. This relief feels like control. In reality, however, emotional avoidance is usually a coping mechanism designed to escape discomfort rather than truly regulate it. The emotions themselves do not disappear. They are simply pushed beneath conscious expression, where they continue influencing thoughts, behaviors, and relationship patterns from the background. For many avoidant individuals, emotional distance became associated with safety long before adulthood. They may have learned early in life that vulnerability led to criticism, rejection, unpredictability, or emotional overwhelm. As a result, they adapted by becoming highly self-reliant and emotionally guarded. Instead of processing emotions openly, they learned to minimize emotional needs altogether. Distance became their method of protection. The problem is that protection and control are not the same thing. Real emotional control involves understanding emotions, tolerating vulnerability, and responding intentionally. Emotional distance often does the opposite by preventing emotions from being fully acknowledged in the first place. When avoidants feel emotionally pressured, they frequently retreat inward. They may stop responding consistently, reduce affection, avoid difficult conversations, or convince themselves they no longer care as deeply as they actually do. From the outside, this can appear emotionally cold or detached. Internally, though, many avoidants are experiencing conflict. Part of them wants connection, while another part fears losing independence, emotional safety, or personal control. Instead of confronting this internal tension directly, they create distance because NCE reduces immediate emotional stimulation. The mistake happens when avoidants interpret this reduction in emotional intensity as emotional mastery. Just because emotions are less visible does not mean they are resolved. In many cases, the feelings remain active beneath the surface and eventually appear in indirect ways. Overthinking, emotional numbness, irritability, anxiety, compulsive distraction, or sudden emotional shutdowns are often signs that suppressed emotions are still operating internally. Emotional distance may quiet the external situation temporarily, but it rarely creates genuine inner peace. Another reason avoidants confuse distance with control is because vulnerability feels unpredictable to them. Emotional openness requires uncertainty. It requires trusting another person enough to risk rejection, disappointment, or dependence. For someone who associates vulnerability with danger, controlling emotional access feels safer than participating fully in emotional intimacy. They may believe that if they stay detached enough, they cannot be hurt deeply. But this strategy comes at a cost. The more emotional distance becomes habitual, the harder genuine connection becomes. Ease. Ironically, avoidants are often more emotionally affected than they appear. Because they suppress emotional expression, they may not fully process feelings in real time. Instead, emotions emerge later through withdrawal, delayed grief, nostalgia, or intrusive thoughts after relationships end. This delayed emotional processing creates confusion because the avoidant person may genuinely believe they were unaffected initially, only to later experience strong emotional reactions they cannot easily explain. Healthy emotional control does not come from avoiding feelings. It comes from developing the ability to stay emotionally present without becoming overwhelmed. That means communicating honestly, tolerating discomfort, and recognizing that vulnerability is not weakness. Emotional maturity involves learning that closeness does not automatically erase independence and that emotional expression does not equal loss of control. Avoidants often spend years believing distance protects them from pain, only to realize that emotional isolation creates a different kind of suffering. The relationships may remain shallow, misunderstandings increase, and unresolved emotions continue repeating in cycles. What feels like control in the moment is often fear operating silently in the background. Real control is not the ability to disconnect emotionally. Real control is the ability to remain emotionally honest without running from discomfort when intimacy becomes real. The longer the disconnect lasts, the more fantasy replaces reality because the human mind cannot tolerate emotional uncertainty for long periods without trying to create its own explanations. When communication disappears between two people, reality slowly becomes incomplete. There are no new conversations, no direct clarification, no emotional feedback, and no accurate understanding of what the other person is truly thinking or feeling. In the absence of real information, the brain begins filling the empty space with imagination. Over time, these imagined stories often become emotionally stronger than the truth itself. At first, the disconnect may feel temporary. Both people may assume they understand each other well enough to predict what the other person is thinking. But as days or weeks pass without meaningful communication, certainty begins to disappear. The brain naturally starts reconstructing the relationship through memory, emotion, and personal fear rather than present reality. Instead of interacting with the actual person, each individual begins interacting with a mental version of them created inside their own mind. This is where fantasy quietly takes control. One person may begin idealizing the relationship, remembering only the emotional highs while forgetting the problems, misunderstandings, or incompatibilities that existed. The other person may do the opposite and create a negative fantasy, convincing themselves they were never cared about at all. Both are forms of distortion because neither reflects the complete reality of the relationship. The longer silence continues, the easier it becomes for emotional imagination to replace factual understanding. The brain is especially vulnerable to fantasy during emotional disconnection because unresolved situations create psychological tension. Humans naturally seek closure and coherence. When answers are missing, the mind starts generating narratives to reduce uncertainty. This process often happens unconsciously. A person may repeatedly replay old memories, analyze tiny details, or imagine conversations that never actually happened. Why occurred? Over time, these imagined emotional scenarios start feeling real, because the brain emotionally responds to thoughts almost as strongly as it responds to direct experiences. Social media often intensifies this process. During periods of disconnection, people begin searching for indirect evidence about the other person's emotional state. A single post, a song lyric, or a delayed response suddenly carries enormous emotional weight. Because there is little direct communication, the mind starts treating fragments of information like proof of hidden meanings. Fantasy grows stronger because the imagination now has unlimited room to interpret everything emotionally. Avoidant dynamics make this even more complicated. Avoidants often suppress direct emotional communication, which increases ambiguity inside relationships. When disconnect happens, both people may remain emotionally attached while pretending not to care. Externally, they appear detached, but internally they continue thinking about the relationship. Because neither side expresses vulnerability openly, assumptions become more powerful than reality. One person imagines rejection, while the other imagines emotional sure. One fantasizes about reunion, while the other fantasizes about escape. Yet neither truly knows what the other feels anymore. Another reason fantasy replaces reality is because memory itself is emotionally selective. People do not remember relationships objectively during emotional absence. The brain edits memories based on emotional needs. Loneliness may cause someone to romanticize the past. Anger may cause someone to exaggerate betrayal. Fear may convince someone they were never valued at all. As emotional distance increases, these mental reconstructions become harder to challenge because there is no real interaction correcting them. This creates a dangerous cycle. The imagined version of the relationship becomes emotionally safer than the unpredictable reality of direct communication. Fantasy allows people to avoid vulnerability because imagination cannot reject them the way real conversations can. But while fantasy may feel emotionally protective, it slowly disconnects people from truth. Eventually, both individuals may become attached not to each other, but to the emotional story they created during the silence. Real relationships survive through clarity, honesty, and continued emotional reality testing. Without communication, the mind begins replacing facts with assumptions, and assumptions almost always reflect fear, desire, or unresolved emotional wounds more than truth. The longer the disconnect lasts, the less people understand each other accurately, and the more they become trapped inside fantasies created by their own unresolved emotions. Healthy communication breaks the cycle faster than emotional games ever will, because emotional games are built on manipulation, fear, and control, while healthy communication is built on clarity, honesty, and emotional safety. When people stop communicating directly and instead rely on silence, They are left to their own devices, and the silence becomes a source of comfort and peace. Mixed signals, delayed responses, jealousy tactics, or emotional withdrawal, they may temporarily feel powerful, but the underlying emotional tension never truly disappears. In most cases, these behaviors only deepen confusion and prolong emotional instability. The relationship becomes centered around guessing, testing, and reacting rather than understanding and connecting. Human beings naturally seek emotional certainty. The nervous system relaxes when it understands with another person. Human interaction provides this clarity. Even difficult conversations reduce anxiety because they remove uncertainty. Emotional games do the opposite. They force the brain into constant interpretation mode where every action feels loaded with hidden meaning. A delayed message becomes a psychological puzzle. Silence becomes emotional punishment. Distance becomes a test of who cares more. Instead of solving problems, emotional games create emotional exhaustion. Many people use emotional games because vulnerability feels risky. Being honest about feelings means risking rejection, disappointment, or loss of control. For avoidant personalities especially, emotional openness can feel deeply uncomfortable because they often associate vulnerability with emotional danger. Rather than directly expressing needs or fears, they may retreat, become inconsistent, or wait for the other person to chase them. The other person may respond with their own defensive strategies by pretending not to care, withdrawing emotionally, or trying to regain power through silence. Both individuals become trapped inside protective behaviors that prevent genuine connection from happening. What makes healthy community ication powerful is that it interrupts this defensive cycle immediately. A simple, emotionally honest conversation can stop weeks or months of misunderstanding. Statements like "I felt hurt when you pulled away," or "I need clarity instead of silence," create emotional transparency. Transparency reduces the brain's need to guess, imagine, or overanalyze. Even if the conversation is uncomfortable, it provides psychological grounding. Both people can finally respond to reality instead of reacting to assumptions created inside their own minds. Emotional games often fail because they are focused on controlling outcomes rather than understanding emotions. Someone may ignore messages to appear less attached, create distance to trigger pursuit, or act emotionally unavailable to protect themselves from rejection. But these strategies usually create instability instead of attraction. The nervous system may become activated by unpredictability, but activation is not the same as healthy connection. Intensity and confusion can feel emotionally addictive, but they rarely create long-term trust or emotional security. Healthy communication, on the other hand, creates emotional regulation. Conversations calm the nervous system because they reduce ambiguity. People no longer need to search for hidden meanings or constantly monitor the relationship for signs of danger. Communication creates a sense of emotional orientation. Both individuals understand what is happening instead of being trapped inside fear-based interpretations. Another important truth is that emotional games often delay personal growth. As long as people focus on controlling each other's reactions, they avoid confronting their own emotional patterns. Silence becomes easier than honesty. Pride becomes easier than vulnerability. But growth only happens when people become willing to communicate directly about uncomfortable emotions, instead of disguising them through manipulation or avoidance. Healthy communication does not guarantee that every relationship will survive, but it does guarantee emotional clarity. Sometimes honest conversations reveal incompatibility, unresolved wounds, or emotional limitations. Yet even painful truth is healthier than prolonged emotional confusion. Clarity allows healing to begin. Emotional games keep people psychologically trapped because there is never full understanding, or closure. Strong relationships are not built through power struggles. They are built through emotional honesty, consistency, and mutual safety. The moment people stop trying to win emotional battles and start trying to understand each other, the destructive cycle begins to break. Healthy communication succeeds because it addresses the real issue directly instead of hiding behind silence, pride, or emotional manipulation.